David Carter drove down the dark, silent streets of the neighborhood, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His wife, Rachel, sat next to him in the passenger seat, arms crossed over her chest, as far away from him as she could get without opening the door and tumbling out into the night. Her eyes stared out the window, her lips set in a thin line, and though she didn't speak a word, her posture screamed fury. They had just left a party at the home of their friends, Emily and Chris Thompson, and for the life of him, David couldn't understand what had gone wrong. The evening had seemed pleasant enough, drinks, food, good company, but Rachel's attitude had shifted somewhere along the way. Now, they drove home in a silence that felt thicker than the dark, heavy air outside. David stole another glance at his wife, hoping she might explain the cold silence hanging between them. But she refused to look at him, her jaw set in that hard, stubborn way he had come to recognize over the years. He hadn't seen her like this in a long time, and it made his stomach twist with anxiety. Finally, unable to take the tension any longer, he spoke. "Rachel," he said cautiously, keeping his voice low, "what's going on? You've been quiet ever since we left." Rachel didn't respond right away. She just kept staring out the window, her arms crossed even tighter over her chest. When she finally did speak, her voice was brittle, like glass about to shatter. "You really don't know, do you?" she said, more of a statement than a question. David frowned, confused. "No, I don't," he admitted. "What happened? Did I say something wrong?" Rachel let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking her head as though she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Of course, you don't know. You weren't paying attention. You never pay attention." David blinked, thrown off by the bitterness in her tone. "Pay attention to what?" "We were at a party, Rachel. I thought everything was fine." "Fine?" Rachel's laugh was louder this time, sharp enough to make David wince. "You thought everything was fine?" David glanced at her again, genuinely baffled now. "Yes, I thought it was fine. We had a good time, didn't we?" Rachel's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she finally turned to face him. "You don't even realize what kind of party that was, do you?" David's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He felt a sudden wave of unease wash over him. "What are you talking about?" Rachel stared at him for a long moment, her gaze piercing, before she finally spoke. "It wasn't just a regular party, David. It was a key party." David blinked, the words not fully registering at first. "A key party?" he repeated, confused. "What does that mean?" Rachel rolled her eyes, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You really don't know, do you? You didn't even notice what was happening around you." Typical. David felt his heart begin to race as his mind searched for an explanation. "Rachel, I don't understand. What's a key party?" Rachel let out a frustrated sigh and turned back to the window, as though the conversation was too exhausting to continue. "A key party, David. You know, where all the wives put their house keys in a bowl, and the husbands draw a key at the end of the night. Whoever's key you pick, that's who you spend the night with." David's heart skipped a beat. "What?" he whispered, his mind reeling. Rachel didn't bother repeating herself. She just sat there, staring out the window, her jaw clenched tight. David felt the blood drain from his face. He had heard about key parties before, stories from the 70s, rumors about suburban couples who swung for thrills, but he had never imagined that Rachel would take him to something like that. And she hadn't even told him. "You knew about this?" David asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Rachel didn't turn around. "Of course, I knew." David's stomach lurched. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Rachel had known all along, and she had still taken him to that party without telling him. She had expected him to just go along with it? "You didn't think to tell me?" David demanded, his voice rising with anger now. You didn't think I might want to know that we were going to a swingers party? Rachel finished for him, her voice flat. No, I didn't tell you. Because I knew exactly how you'd react. Like you're reacting right now. David stared at her in disbelief. React like this? Rachel, you wanted me to pick some random woman's key and sleep with her? Rachel turned to face him again, her expression cold and unyielding. It's not just about that, David. It's about excitement. It's about bringing something new into our marriage. Something we clearly need. David felt like the wind had been knocked out of him. Something we need? What are you talking about? Rachel threw her hands up in frustration. David, we've been married for 10 years. 10 years. Don't you think we need something different? Something exciting? I love you, but I can't pretend that everything is perfect when it's not. I'm bored, David. David's heart sank. Bored. Was that what their marriage had become to her? He had never imagined she felt this way. He had always thought they were happy, that their marriage was strong. But now, sitting here in the car with his wife telling him that she was bored, he felt like his world was collapsing around him. I can't believe this, David muttered, shaking his head. You think the solution is to sleep with someone else? Rachel's eyes flashed with anger. It's not about sleeping with someone else, David. It's about the thrill, the excitement. It's just one night. One night, and then we go back to our normal lives. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. The woman sitting next to him, the woman he had loved and cherished for the past decade, was telling him that she wanted to sleep with another man, and she expected him to be okay with it? Rachel, I can't do this, David said, his voice trembling with emotion. I can't be a part of this. Rachel crossed her arms over her chest again, her expression hardening. Of course, you can't. You never could. David felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. What's that supposed to mean? Rachel turned to face him, her eyes cold. It means you've never been willing to step outside your little comfort zone. You've never been willing to take risks, to try something new. You're so stuck in your ways that you can't even see what's happening to us. David stared at her, stunned. What's happening to us? Rachel, I thought we were happy. Rachel laughed bitterly. Happy? David, when was the last time we did anything exciting? When was the last time we did something just for us? Our life is so predictable, so routine. I can't take it anymore. David's heart ached as he listened to her. He had always thought they were building a life together, that they were growing stronger as a couple. But now, he realized that Rachel had been feeling trapped, bored, and unfulfilled. And he hadn't even noticed. I didn't know you felt this way, David said quietly, his voice full of regret. I thought everything was okay. Rachel sighed, her expression softening just a little. David, I love you. But I need more. I need to feel alive again. David stared at her, his heart breaking. He had never imagined that she felt this way, and now that he knew, he didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to fight for their marriage, to find a way to fix things. But another part of him, the part that was hurt and angry, couldn't believe that she would suggest something like this. So, what do we do now? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel didn't answer right away. She looked out the window again, her face unreadable. After a long pause, she finally spoke. I don't know. David felt a wave of frustration wash over him. You don't know? Rachel, you took me to a swingers party without telling me. You're telling me you're bored with our marriage, and now you don't know what to do? Rachel turned to face him again, her eyes flashing with anger. I'm trying to be honest with you, David. I'm trying to tell you how I feel. What do you want from me? I want you to respect our marriage, David shot back. I want you to tell me the truth before we end up in a situation like this. I want you to. To what? Rachel interrupted, her voice rising. To pretend everything's fine? To keep living this boring, predictable life? I can't do that, David. I won't. David clenched his jaw, his anger bubbling up again. So, what? You'd rather sleep with some random guy than work on our marriage? Rachel's face twisted with frustration. It's not about sleeping with someone else, David. It's about trying something new. It's about excitement. It's just one night. David stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. Just one night? You think one night of sleeping with another man is going to fix everything? Rachel didn't answer right away. She looked away, her jaw clenched. I don't know, she said softly. But I had to try something. David felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never felt so hurt, so betrayed. The woman he had loved for 10 years was sitting next to him, telling him that she needed something more, something he couldn't give her. I can't do this, Rachel, David said quietly. I can't be a part of this. Rachel didn't respond. She just sat there, staring out the window, her arms crossed over her chest. The silence between them was suffocating, thick with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. After what felt like an eternity, David pulled the car to a stop in front of their house. He turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. This is your choice, David said quietly, not looking at her. You can come inside with me, and we can try to figure this out. Or you can go back to that party and spend the night with whoever's key you end up with. But if you do, don't bother coming home again. Rachel stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. For a moment, David thought she might choose him, that she might realize what she was about to throw away and come back to him. But then, slowly, she reached for the door handle. I'll see you in the morning, she whispered, her voice trembling. David watched in disbelief as Rachel stepped out of the car and walked back down the street toward the party. He sat there for a long time, his heart heavy with the weight of her decision. When he finally drove away, the tears he had been holding back spilled down his cheeks. His marriage was over. David Carter sat in the darkened living room of his house, the silence pressing in on him like a heavy blanket. The clock on the wall ticked away the seconds, each one louder than the last. It was well past midnight, but David hadn't been able to sleep. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the night over and over again in his head. He couldn't believe what had happened. Rachel, his wife, his partner, the woman he had loved for over a decade, had chosen to go back to that party. She had chosen to spend the night with another man. And she had done it without a second thought. David felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had never felt so hurt, so betrayed. How could she do this? How could she just throw everything away like that? He had always prided himself on being a good husband. He had worked hard to provide for Rachel and their 2 children, had been faithful, had loved her with everything he had. But now, sitting alone in the dark, he realized that it hadn't been enough. It hadn't been enough for Rachel. David closed his eyes, his hands gripping the armrests of the chair. He could still hear her voice in his head, telling him that she needed more, that she was bored, that she wanted excitement. It felt like a knife to the heart, twisting deeper with every word. He had never seen this coming. Sure, they had their problems, what couple didn't, but he had never imagined that Rachel was so unhappy. He had never imagined that she would go behind his back and take him to a swingers party, of all things. And now, she had chosen to stay. David felt a lump rise in his throat as the reality of the situation sank in. His marriage was over. There was no coming back from this. The clock on the wall ticked louder, and David found himself staring at it, as if it held the answers to the questions swirling in his mind. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to move on from this? How was he supposed to explain this to their children? The thought of his kids, 8-year-old Lily and 6-year-old Max, made David's heart ache even more. They had no idea what was happening, no idea that their family was falling apart. And how could he tell them? How could he explain that their mother had chosen someone else over their father? David buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He had never felt so lost, so broken. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built with Rachel, was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. After what felt like hours, David finally lifted his head and wiped his eyes. He needed to get out of the house, needed to clear his mind. Sitting here in the dark, replaying the night over and over again, wasn't helping. He needed to move, to do something, anything, to take his mind off the pain. David stood up and grabbed his keys from the table by the door. He didn't know where he was going, but anywhere was better than here. David drove aimlessly through the empty streets, the cool night air blowing in through the open window. The city was quiet, the only sounds the occasional distant hum of a car passing by. His mind was still reeling, but at least the motion of the car gave him something to focus on. He couldn't stop thinking about what Rachel had said, the way she had looked at him, the way she had walked out of the car and back to that party. The betrayal cut deep, like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He had never thought Rachel was capable of something like this. She had always been strong, loyal, the rock of their family. How had things gone so wrong? David pulled into an empty parking lot by the beach and turned off the engine. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled the silence, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of calm. The ocean had always been a place of peace for him, a place where he could think, where he could find clarity. But tonight, even the ocean couldn't soothe the storm raging inside him. He stepped out of the car and walked down to the water's edge, the cool sand sinking beneath his shoes. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a silver glow over the waves, but David barely noticed. His mind was too full, too heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He stood there for a long time, staring out at the vast expanse of water, his thoughts swirling like the tide. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to move forward? He had always been a planner, always had a clear vision for his future, for his family. But now, everything was in ruins. How could he possibly pick up the pieces? David's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was Rachel. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. He wasn't ready to talk to her, wasn't ready to hear whatever excuses or explanations she might have. But then, against his better judgment, he answered. David, Rachel's voice came through the line, breathless, like she had been running. Where are you? David's jaw clenched, the anger he had been holding back rising to the surface. Does it matter? Rachel was silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. I'm at home. I've been waiting for you. David let out a bitter laugh. You're at home? After everything that happened tonight, you're just home? David, please, Rachel said, her voice trembling. I know you're angry, but we need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about, David said, his voice cold. You made your choice. David, please, Rachel pleaded. I made a mistake. I know that now. I was so caught up in everything, and I didn't think it through. But I love you. I don't want to lose you. David's heart twisted at her words. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was just a mistake, that they could somehow fix things. But the pain was still too raw, too fresh. I can't do this, Rachel, David said quietly. I can't just pretend that everything's okay. David, please, Rachel whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. I'll do anything to make it up to you. Just come home, and we'll figure it out. Please. David closed his eyes, his chest aching with the weight of her words. Part of him wanted to go back, to give her another chance. But another part of him, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, couldn't let go of the hurt. I don't know if I can, David said, his voice barely audible. Please, David, Rachel whispered. Just come home. David stood there in silence for a long time, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore in the background. Finally, he spoke. I'll be there soon. David drove home in silence, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Could he forgive Rachel? Could they move past this? He didn't know. But he knew that he had to try, if only for the sake of their family. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark, save for the dim glow of a single lamp in the living room. Rachel was sitting on the couch, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face pale and drawn. She looked up as David entered, her eyes red and swollen from crying. David, she whispered, her voice trembling. David stood there for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to start. I'm sorry, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I hurt you. I know I made a mistake. But I love you, and I want to fix this. Please. David took a deep breath, his chest tight with emotion. I don't know if I can. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. Please, David. Don't say that. We can fix this. We can get through this. David stared at her, his heart aching. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that they could somehow move past this. But the pain was still too fresh, too raw. I don't know, David said quietly. I don't know. Rachel's tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. Please, David. Please. David stood there for a long moment, watching her cry, his own heart breaking. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if they could ever truly fix what had been broken. But he knew one thing for sure, he couldn't give up. Not yet. The days that followed were some of the hardest of David's life. He and Rachel had long, difficult conversations, laying everything out on the table. It wasn't easy. There were tears, anger, and more than a few moments where David wanted to walk away and never look back. But slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild. Rachel apologized again and again, promising that she would do whatever it took to earn David's trust back. She admitted that she had been selfish, that she had let her own desires cloud her judgment, and that she had nearly destroyed their family because of it. David listened, but it was hard. The betrayal still lingered, like a wound that hadn't fully healed. He didn't know if he could ever trust her again, didn't know if their marriage could ever truly recover. But for the sake of their children, he had to try. They went to counseling, worked through their issues one painful step at a time. It was slow going, but little by little, they began to make progress. There were setbacks, of course, moments where the anger and hurt resurfaced, but they kept pushing forward. David wasn't sure if things would ever be the same between them. The trust had been shattered, and rebuilding it would take time. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward. Months passed, and slowly, life began to return to something resembling normalcy. David and Rachel worked hard to rebuild their marriage, to heal the wounds that had been inflicted. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments where the pain of the past threatened to overwhelm them. But they kept going, kept fighting for each other. Their children, blissfully unaware of the storm that had nearly torn their family apart, continued to thrive. Lily and Max were the light of David's life, and every time he looked at them, he was reminded of why he was doing this, why he was fighting so hard to save his marriage. One evening, as David sat on the porch with Rachel, watching the sunset, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. It had been a long, difficult road, but they had made it. They had come through the storm, and though they were both battered and bruised, they were still standing. Rachel reached over and took his hand, her grip gentle, but firm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft. "For not giving up on us." David looked at her, his heart full of emotion. "Thank you for fighting with me." They sat there in silence, hand in hand, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the world. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was theirs. And for David, that was enough.